Hold on. Anyone not ready? All right. Hi, my name is Andrew, and I affirm resolve the United States ought to guarantee a universal child care. I mean, guarantee universal child care. My value for this debate is morality due to the word ought in the resolution, which expresses a moral obligation. My standard in this debate is social justice. Social justice seeks acceptance for all. Paris 18 states social justice is a hypothesis of non discriminatory relations between individual and society. Social justice seeks equality, disfavor discrimination, and prioritizes fairness. Social justice helps us work towards celebrating diversity. A society that does not celebrate and acknowledge the differences that we are born with can lead to resentment, hostility, or even worse. Contention 1. You can write this down as ableism. Private childcare programs are inaccessible to disabled kids. Also increases economic inequality due to parents quitting their jobs. Novoa 20 writes, ableism compounds childcare crisis. Many openings are inaccessible to children with disabilities, and special ed teachers whom are paid far lower than general ed peers may be especially likely to leave. This, coupled with poor oversight and enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, means children are left out. A larger proportion of children with disabled children experience have difficulty finding care, 34% versus 25%. Parents face scheduling challenges and concerns about quality, and these children represent estimated 15% of United States childhood population and are protected by IDEA, ADA, and Section 504. The ADA and Section 504 define disability broadly. Both prohibit discrimination because childcare programs operate with razor thin margins that make financing accommodations difficult. Children with disabilities are often excluded, and parents of children with disabilities are more likely to report a lack of available slots. These constitute illegal forms of discrimination, and childcare struggles can affect the careers of parents with disabled children. Many leave their job, and driving parents out of the workforce exacerbates economic inequalities. Next, a universal childcare is key to solving ableism. Novoa 20, right? Fixing the childcare system requires an approach such as Working Families Act. In addition to making childcare reliable and affordable to all families, the act includes provisions to ensure high quality. It would increase supply of accessible care and create intervention services in childcare settings and allow providers to fund facilities to improve accessibility. These changes would improve child care to those with disabilities. Next, ableism justifies discrimination based on socially constructed and artificially created differences. This marginalizes and segregates people to different. Collins 13 writes, ableism perpetuates educational segregation and unequal opportunity. Disability categories have been used to justify oppression, has been used historically to marginalize, segregate, and disempower people marked as different. But the concept of disability has been used to justify discrimination against other groups by attributing disability to them. The mark of disability was called upon to segregate students from different groups socially and culturally positioned as different due to perceived ethnicity or status. Contention 2. You can write this down as indigeneity. Current federal policies are undermining Native American education. The affirmative early education programs are critical to revitalizing it. Keel 13 writes, Native education programs would prepare parents to support children. Family engagement increases achievement. The $1.2 trillion budget reductions is undermining the success of early education programs, equate 57,000 fewer children served and 18,000 staff members suffering. This is unacceptable, and early education programs are relying on federal funds. Students who most need programs will be left underserved, and early education bridge the gap, forcing Native people to move from their homelands, compel the administration to make students have access to early education. Next, education in the status quo forces natives to give up on their identities. So allowing natives to teach other natives is key to solve this. Cambacho 14 writes, American education has been a source of cultural violence and erased for Native American students, lost of their Indian identities. The acquire mastery over civilized culture and iron routine and civilized machine education is linked with acculturation. Mastering the tools of the playlist, she lost a part of herself. Next, integrating language and culture education into early childhood education is vital to reinvigorating native language and culture. Grunwald 16 writes, early childhood in language immersion programs reinvigorate language and cultural practices. Children who learn their native language and culture have success with education and well-being. Thousands of Native Americans were removed from their communities to attend schools that forbade them from speaking their native language. The language is taken away by force. Next, Coloniality generates a permanent state of exception that is the root cause of the death of ethics of war and underwrites a hellish experience where death, murder, war, and racism are ordinary facts of life. Maldonado Torres 8 writes, Damnation, life, and hell is colonialism. Human beings become slaves and they are vanquished in war. In a war translates into conquered people and non-European peoples are inferior should assume a position of slavery. The hell of war becomes a condition that defies the reality of racialized slaves. The condemned is a subject to exist in a permanent state of hell. The condemned inhibit a context in a confrontation with death and murder is ordinary, and coloniality produces a permanent state of war that colonized subjects cannot evade or escape. Killability or rapeability are inscribed into images of colonial bodies. Contention 3. You can write this down as ableism. Lack of childcare hurts people of color the most because of systemic racism. Universal childcare is key to combating this. Novoa 20 writes, broken childcare system is an important issue for parents of color due to occupation and residential segregation. Without action to bolster childcare, parents of color will be forced to between putting food in the table and providing children with supervision and enrichment. Lack of childcare undermine ability to recover from pandemics, devastating economic impacts on communities of color. Parents of color were more likely than their white counterparts to experience childcare disruptions when parents are unable to find childcare. Ability to provide for their family suffers. Mark Descartes there. Next, racism is must be rejected in every instance without receipts. Prerequisite to morality. Miami 2000 writes, struggle against racism will be long, probably never achieved. Yet for this very reason, it is a struggle to be undertaken without receipts. To accept a racist universe to the slightest degree to endorse fear, injustice, and violence. I'll open across. Mark the last card, violence too.
Okay, are you ready for cross?
Yes.
Okay. Time starts now. So for your first contention about ableism, so how exactly does like ableism justify like, all discrimination? Like how did ableism explain why slaves were taken during like the transatlantic slave trade?
I mean, Collins 13 gives a specific example of like educational segregation where bodies, like particularly black bodies, were viewed as inferior and unable to, say, like coherently talk or things like that. And those tropes of ableism were what justified educational segregation. There's
Okay.
also examples of like immigration policy and anti-immigration policies are predicated upon a notion that certain people should not fit into a paradigm, but that like presupposes a static paradigm.
Okay. So for the second card that says that a universal childcare is key to solve ableism, like where does this card say universal childcare? It just says like the Working Families Act, which probably isn't the same thing.
Yeah, like all of it says working families and all of these universal policies are key. It also says
Where does it
intervention,
say that?
like
Like where does it
literally
say
intervention services in child settings allow providers to fund facilities to improve
no,
accessibility.
where does
So,
it say universal childcare?
oh, it doesn't say universal childcare, but
Okay.
like it says that childcare systems require like universal norms and like significant investments so that disabled people can fit in.
Okay. For your indigeneity contention, you talk about how like current American education is like culturally erasing or cultural erasure. So how does like the federal government, like the American government, giving these native kids education, like how does that do anything?
What do you mean? Like we resolved decades of like so our
How?
argument is that we shouldn't like resolve the hundreds of years of colonialism that happened, and we're saying
No, no,
that
no. My question is
start
just
new.
like, how is the U.S. government giving natives education any different from
Oh,
what's happening
that's
right
not
now?
what. No, all right. So yeah, I get like the U.S. is a pretty bad country, and like they've broken every treaty with the natives. But we're saying that this is different, and it's
No, no,
actually
my
different.
question is just like, so okay. So your Camacho card says that American education is a source of cultural violence. So how does
Yeah,
the American government giving natives universal childcare that involves education, how is that any different from what is happening in the status quo?
and so we would say that it can conceptualize this project as like the United States giving a blank check to natives and saying that yo, you can use this as like universal childcare, language education for children, things like that. So it will be tribal governed and not U.S. governed, meaning that there won't be intervention. You can make the argument that there will be intervention, but like
So does like the
you say
BIE
we,
get involved?
what do you mean?
Like the
Like, can you explain
Bureau
what
of
that
Indian
means?
Education? Like does that get involved?
Like, is that American based?
Sure, it's an American agency.
I mean, no, we were saying there's no colonial intervention.
Okay. Okay, how can colonial violence explain like why the US decided to bomb Syria like a week ago?
It can explain why we have like problematized Syria and things like that. We have
Okay.
problematized the Middle East due to like, yeah.
All right. I'll take running prep. Time starts now. Okay, that was 38 seconds. I'll send it.
All
It
right.
will be 2 off then case. On case, it'll be contention 1, contention 2, contention 3.
Is there gonna be framing or
No.
okay? I'll tell you when I get the document.
Okay, I just sent it.
I just got it.
Okay.
Let's
Is
see,
anybody
download.
not good? Oh, yes. Andrew, are
All
you good?
right.
All right.
Yeah, I'm good.
Contention 1 is the counterplan. We offer a counterplan against the affirmative proposal for universalized childcare. Resolved. The United States should scale back and concentrate childcare towards the most disadvantaged. The counterplan solves. The best way of providing high quality, high resource childcare is to target only the most disadvantaged children. Eden 2021. The quality of children's early environments matter. Healthier environments help children reach their potential. Less healthy environments stimulate their development, potentially permanently. For the most deeply disadvantaged students, highly resourced, high quality early education programs can provide an environment healthier than what is available at home, which can produce benefits lasting even into the next generation. But for other students, spending time in a childcare setting rather than the home could do lasting cognitive and non cognitive damage. Uh, for the median disadvantaged student today, center-based childcare in pre-kindergarten may be a less healthy environment for child development than their homes. Policymakers should not allocate additional taxpayer dollars to programs that may harm children. The most prudent course of action would certainly not to be to provide universal childcare, early education subsidies, or even to expand means-tested programs, but scale down the number of students who are served by publicly subsidized early education and focus existing resources more intensively on the most disadvantaged children. Scale back and concentrate early education subsidies. Contention 2 is crime. Universal childcare causes crime. Erickson and Stevens 2021. The scale up of universal childcare in Quebec was also associated with a subsequent sharp and contemporaneous increase in criminal behavior across Quebec, as the rate of crime conviction jumped to 22%. As the following figure indicates, though crime rates in Quebec are lower than the rest of Canada, there was a significant increase in crime accusation and conviction rates for cohorts exposed to the childcare program. And universal childcare increases crime. The Quebec program, the largest universal childcare experiment, proves. Baker 19. Estimates are generally consistent with the graphical evidence. Exposure to the Quebec program leads to higher rates of crime, a 27% increase. For accused across all categories, we estimate a rise of a mean of 1,872 accusations. This is a rise of 19%. The result is slightly higher in percentage terms for convictions at 22%. The impact of exposure to the Quebec program is largest for property crime. The estimated impacts on other criminal code violations are almost as large. Crimes against persons at 16%, drug crimes is over 23% of the mean for convictions, larger absolute impacts on the crime rate for boys, especially or particularly for drugs. Early life deterioration in behavior, estimated magnitude of the increase of crime. And perceptions of high crime disincentivizes businesses and chokes economic activity in those areas. Budaru 12. A reputation for high crime can hurt the local economy. Having high crime rates or even a reputation of high crime raises the cost of living and doing business. People consider crime when deciding where to live, work, and do business. The concentration of poverty and high dropout rates go hand in hand with crime. There's a link between crime and economic growth. Examining statistics from 1979 to 2002. Crime restricts economic growth. It imposes costs on businesses. They're spending money on greater security precautions. A higher crime rate discourages immigration of skilled workers to the area. And economic decline increases the chance of war. Royal 10. Periods of economic decline increase the likelihood of a conflict. Economic crisis could usher in a redistribution of power. That leads to uncertainty, increasing the risk of miscalculation. Global economic cycles impact the likelihood of conflict among major, medium, and small powers. If trade declines, the likelihood for conflict increases. The linkages between conflict and prosperity are strong and mutually reinforcing. Economic decline has been linked with an increase in the likelihood of terrorism. Economic decline and the use of force are correlated. Periods of weak economic performance in the US are statistically linked to an increase in the use of force. Now let's go on to the affirmative case. The counterplan solves the entirety of the affirmative case. It scales down childcare for only disadvantaged students like the people that the affirmative tries to solve for. Next, let's go into their ableism contention. Their own evidence says that that the current discrimination going on does not adhere to the ADA or Section 504 or IDEA. That means it's going to get remedied in the status quo even without universal childcare because it's literally just illegal. But also, their solvency evidence that says a universal childcare solves literally does not say the words universal childcare in it at all, which means you cannot vote on this contention. Now let's go on to contention 2 about Native Americans. First, is that if the US provides Native Americans with this American education or this American childcare, then that's obviously no different than what is happening in the status quo. They're going to come up here and say that it is native teaching natives or that it is tribal run. But first of all, that none of their evidence sort of implicates that, or they have no evidence to say that that would be true. But also, it is literally the US government doing it, and childcare is not just a check, it is actually doing the program. Next. Non-federally recognized tribes are denied access to sovereignty and education in the status quo. First 16. Obama held a tribal nations conference. 50 tribes representing tens of thousands of people were not part of the event. Sovereignty, that's exactly what we're fighting for. 87 tribes have petitioned for recognition. Only 51 have received the determination. Two-thirds uh, Two-thirds of those were denials. Recognized tribes receive federal support for housing, education, and healthcare. Recognition has implications across the board, from domestic relations to education. Unrecognized tribes have second-class status and remain vulnerable to the not-so-tender mercies of local and state authorities. Republican leadership has attempted to cut off all funding for the federal acknowledgement process. What that means is that even if we allow universal childcare, we allow childcare to be sent to like these checks to be sent, is that non-federally recognized tribes or tribes that are not recognized by the U.S. government or reservations that are not recognized will not get the benefits of this, which means they cannot solve. Next. First, actually, let's go on to the racism contention. Universal childcare will only lead to rich white people manipulating the system and leaving disadvantaged families in the dust. Dragni and Tele 20. We studied the system that is designed to provide uniform and high quality childcare for all children. We describe excessive segregation of children by socioeconomic background centers. Take advantage of their discretion by enrolling more advantaged children. Excessive segregation of children by socioeconomic background stems from parental application behavior. Advantaged parents have better access to networks. Policymakers may want to take measures to secure the opportunities of children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Since segregation from parental application behavior far exceeds residential segregation, our results suggest that generous public childcare targeted exclusively at disadvantaged children can improve the development and reduce sexual inequality in childhood. Universal childcare is not targeted at children from disadvantaged families, and parental responses can undermine many benefits of universal childcare expansions. Universal childcare may not be able to fully counteract inequalities unless deliberate action is taken. And obviously, allowing white people to get the benefits of universal childcare as well, and forcing these black students to have to be integrated into a white system is obviously very, very bad for their development and teaches them bad habits. I'm ready for cross.
Are are you good?
Yeah.
All right. So how do we evaluate your impact of war on your second contention under my framework?
War probably affects disadvantaged people the most because they have the least resources, but also crime probably affects black students the most because they're disproportionately blamed for those impacts.
All right, sure. So on your on your Drondre and Tully evidence, this is talking about a study done in Norway. How can you apply the laws in Norway to America?
Right. So we argue that the system would remain the same, or the idea is the same, because no matter where we implement it, what
Why is
happens is
that
that
true?
because the idea is the same, is that even if when we provide universal childcare, is that these advantaged people simply have better access to the best centers, they have better networking, etc.
Okay. All right. So on your crime DA, so where do you have any uniqueness evidence saying that crime is low right now or the economy is awesome right now?
Right. I mean, we would just argue that if we any increase in crime is probably bad, but also
Or why
like
does it increase crime? I don't understand. How does giving babies like teaching babies how to speak English or like native languages, how does that cause crime?
I mean, that's what like the Quebec experiment proves.
I mean, what does
Because
the
like
Quebec experiment say? Does
it
it just say
creates
like all
like
of these kids are going to
it
start
creates like
popping
a
pills?
bunch of
Like, I don't get it.
it creates a bunch of stress and like negative emotional outcomes that force them to like commit crimes or encourage them to commit crimes.
Wait, why did he get like negative emotions or like negative mental states?
Because that's what childcare does to them. I mean,
All right, like where in your evidence does indicate that this is like, oh, Quebec kind of did this and kind of sucked.
it
Like
literally it says
there's no
when
correlation
it
between.
says like a scale up of universal childcare in Quebec led to like these massive increases in crime.
It said at the rate of crime commission jumped 22%. How do you know this like childcare uniquely caused this? Why couldn't it have just been another factor we're not thinking about?
I mean, like both our evidence is pretty clear as to why universal childcare did this, but also like
You're not explaining the warrant to me. You need to explain to me like why does it certainly cause boys to like do drugs or like
I literally
property
just
crimes
told
to
you
happen?
because it activates like these negative emotional response or it activates this stress that
All right, sure. I don't think
like
your evidence
encourages
says
them to
that, but
do this.
okay. All right. So your evidence talks about like boys popping pills or property crimes. How does that like have an internal link to like businesses having to pay a ton of money or like economic decline?
Yeah, so basically, when there's a bunch of crime in an area, then businesses are or disincentivized from investing in those areas because obviously crime is bad for business.
Wait,
But
so
then
if
that causes economic decline.
some high school students started doing drugs, how does that like, which is what your own evidence indicates, by the way, how does that like increase cost for businesses? Because that's
I mean,
your
no, it's
what your
not
evidence is.
increasing costs. It's just like overall increasing crime
Your
across the board is bad for investment in those
but your
areas.
evidence says that yeah,
It talks
that's
about
fine.
property crimes, which is probably bad for businesses.
Yeah, sure. Um, all right, I'll take part now. All right. Oh shoot. I took 3:30. The order will be case, like the affirmative case, the, the counterplan, and then the DA.
So order on case just 1 to 3.
Yeah, no, I answer the top level thing
Okay.
on top. Yeah, it's just top down. Sorry. Actually, I'll take like 10 seconds on word. Hold it. Yeah, 10 seconds from WordPress. All right. So yeah. Time starts. Now, first is he counterplan solves the entirety of the affirmative. I will answer that on the counterplan. Next, on the ableist in contention, I will concede to their argument about the ADA or whatever argument they made. It's just defense, not offense. I'm not going for the ableist in contention. Next, on the natives contention first, I will explain the natives contention for you. The natives contention is pretty much saying that in the status quo, federal policies are extremely bad for natives and extremely bad for natives. And it is cultural appropriation and getting rid of their cultures is just pretty much cultural and linguistic genocide. We're saying that we should sign a blank check for Native Americans so that they can use this blank check for universal childcare and give birth to these languages and allow natives to teach natives and native languages to preserve their culture in the first place. This has a specific internal link into our colonialism stuff because it's saying that we can finally start new and resolve these forms of cultural genocide by letting natives do what natives want to do, not what U.S. wants to do, which answers all of their. Well, it's no different argument. Our evidence specifically says that natives teaching natives is good and that American intervention is bad, which answers your first argument as to how this is no different from any other American treaty. Next, they say that no federally recognized tribes are denied access. But again, this is a form of self-determination where natives get to decide what they want to do. If natives get to decide what they want to do, we give it to what we have recognized tribes, but those tribes get to give it to other tribes or things like that if they want to do it. It's a form of self-determination, and it is still sufficient to solve. Next, on the racism contention, they read this Drange piece of evidence. But first it's about Norway, not the U.S. Which first it's about Norway, and first extend the racism contention, which says that Black people and Black children do not have access to universal, you do not have access to childcare system, which means that we should obviously resolve things like that. We should resolve things like that. And racism is bad because racism is bad as a prerequisite to morality because it's literally a state of damnation, and it's literally saying that Black people don't matter, which is obviously bad under my framework, which they have conceded. I will answer their specific arguments. First, they say that their evidence is first not about Norway. Also, it's our argument is that universal childcare specifically targeted. I'll read that evidence on the current plan. And lastly, their own evidence says that it's good. It literally says that there is little segregation in participation in Norwegian childcare. That's a quote from their card, which proves that this flows affirmative. Next, they say integration bad, but they haven't read the evidence, and they just say that obviously, but they haven't gestured warrant, so it literally doesn't matter on the counter plan. Sorry, my dog. First, permutation to build universal childcare in the context of policies is targeted and scaled back for rich people. 116 Congress writes, children at least 6 weeks of age but not yet required to attend school may participate in programs, and families must pay a subsidized fee based on income. Fees are waived for children from families with incomes below 200%, and fees are capped at 7% of a family's income. Next, their counterplan links to the DA. Their link is just that these childcare systems trigger negative emotions, but they use the same system of disadvantage grades. This meaning that they link it to this and it justifies a permutation to vote again. And also, it doesn't solve specifically for the natives contention. Hold them to their evidence, which says that U.S. intervention through policymakers solves. It can't resolve natives having to teach natives. This outweighs on the dissent because of the root cause argument about how the root cause of war, is a colonialism because it justifies a state of exception. And framing goes conceded, meaning under social justice, this solvency deficit outweighs on the dissent. First, they don't have uniqueness for anything in this round. They have not said that crime is high right now, or crime is low right now, or crime is low right now, or economy is low right now. I mean that you can't grant them any of their offense, and you can't grant them any of their offense. And crime is pretty high, right? I mean, and crime in the U.S. is pretty much always high, which present this is intuitively a non-unique impact. Also, the link is pretty bad. It just says offhandedly mentions negative emotions, and it's about Quebec, meaning that it's definitely not about the affirmatives. Next thing, internal link is also pretty bad. Their evidence only talks about like boys like popping pills and doing drugs. There's no internal link to different with that, and businesses having more costs, which proves that they literally don't have an internal link in this round. Also, we outweigh on framing because they have conceded framing in this round, and it impacts like racism, native genocide outweigh any risk of war, and also like, outweigh any risk of war. But like, there's this that is just pretty bad. There's no uniqueness. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, I'll take prep time starts now. Okay, is everyone or is anyone not ready?
I'm good.
Okay. It'll be the counterplan, the DA, and then contention 2, contention 3 on the F case.
All right.
All right. Let's start with the counterplan. The counterplan says we should reduce childcare and only provide childcare to the most disadvantaged individuals and disadvantaged students. The counterplan would lead to a reduction in status quo childcare for most families. We are reducing childcare and concentrating all federal childcare efforts on high quality, high resource childcare. The counterplan solves the entirety of the affirmative case because it would provide care, in fact, better care to these disadvantaged groups that the app talks about, such as Black people, people of color, and Native Americans. And the net benefit to this is the crime DA, because specifically universal childcare, where these Black students or these students are being forced into really bad quality facilities, or these really bad quality, or these really like bad centers, that's what triggers this negative emotional response and triggers the stress that causes them to commit crimes. But I'll get more on that on the dissent. Now let's go down what they said to my counterplan. First is that they made a permutation and they read this card that said a universal childcare system is targeted and specifically that it is subsidized. But that is not what our evidence talks about at all. Our evidence, in fact, says that trying to increase subsidies or subsidization is actually bad. It's not that we need to subsidize childcare and make it so that people under a certain income pay this much or people above a certain income pay that much. Is that we need to concentrate all our resources towards these disadvantaged students. Which means universal childcare is not what the counterplan is at all, because the counterplan is saying we need to target and reduce and scale back back childcare. Well, obviously, universal childcare does not do that, but also we are just not talking about subsidization at all, which is specifically what their evidence talks about. Now, they said that the counterplan links to the DISAD, but I've said this before, which is that specifically when these children are forced into bad quality facilities or these really, really bad facilities, that is what triggers them. Like that's what triggers this negative emotional response, which is what our evidence says, and that is what motivates them or encourages them to commit crimes. Next, they said that it does not solve the native contention. However, if we are targeting and if we are scaling back and if we are sorry, not targeting. If we are scaling back childcare and if we are concentrating it towards these students, towards these native students, then that can definitely solve. Because even if it's a blank check or if it's the federal government doing something, it doesn't have to be a universal childcare. It can be a scaled back system, or it can't be a concentrated system towards Native Americans. We can definitely solve their natives contention. Now let's go on to the DA. First, is that they say we have no uniqueness, but specifically what we talk about is that even if crime is high right now, is that what our evidence indicates is that in Quebec, which is the largest universal childcare system and the best study that's ever been done, is that it would increase it exponentially 22%, which means even if crime is super high right now, it just increases it to the point and past the brink. Next, they say that this card is about Quebec or evidence about Quebec and not the US, but it doesn't matter because the concept remains the same. Because no matter if it's in Canada or it's in the US, the concept of universal childcare remains the same, especially because the DISTAT is not based on what specific policies implemented or what specific laws exist. It's simply that the concept of universal childcare is bad. But also, as I said before, the system in Quebec was the largest universal childcare study done. It was the largest program ever implemented, which makes a Quebec like an analysis in Quebec is uniquely good. Next, they said that like 16-year-olds popping like a 16-year-old doing drugs does not harm businesses, but our evidence also talks about crimes against people or crimes against properties or property crime, which obviously would negatively affect businesses and disincentivize them from investing in these areas, and it sort of chokes economic activity in these areas, which is also goes pretty much unresponded to. Finally, they said that they outweigh on framing, but this is not true for a few reasons. First is that if a war broke out or when war breaks out, obviously it impacts disadvantaged people the most because they have the least resources to deal with the fallout. Also, specifically in the context of crime, Black students or Native students are blamed the most for it, or they're proportionate or disproportionately. They disproportionately take the blame for it, which is also falls under social justice. Now let's move on to the affirmative case. On the second contention about Native Americans, what are my argument was that if the federal government or the American government provides Native Americans with this American childcare, this American education, then it is no different to what is happening in the status quo, and it is culturally erasure. All they say is that the federal government will pay off the natives a fat check, or they'll pay them off a blank check to do stuff with it and do universal childcare, and it will be natives teaching natives. But once again, they dropped what I said in my first speech, which is that there's no evidence. There's not even a card in this contention that talks about universal childcare. They're sort of just making this up on the spot with no evidence as to why it would be implemented this way or how it would be implemented. But even if but specifically because it's a United States federal government doing it, that probably means that it would be a United States federal government program, especially because childcare is not just a check, it is a program that the federal government has to implement. Once again, they just have no evidence to sort of support their idea that it will be a blank check paid off to natives. Next, on non-federally recognized tribes, they made a really bad responses, which is simply that it is self-determination. But however, the problem with this is that if it's a check, like they say, then obviously the United States needs to know who to pay that off to, which they cannot do if they do not recognize some tribes. So even if some tribes will pay other tribes, there's no guarantee for this. And obviously it just waters down the whole thing so that it cannot solve. And again, they have no evidence that says that self-determination solves. Now let's move on to the racism contention. They say that Norway does not equal the US, but once again, the concept remains the same, which is that these rich white advantaged people manipulate the system and have more connections and are able to make it so that their children can get the best facilities, which obviously applies with this in Norway, the US. Next, they say that the universal childcare is a targeted system, but once again, this is not what we're talking about, which means you cannot flow that across. Finally, they say that our card says little segregation, but our card talking about little segregation and participation, which means that Black and white students participate equally in the system, but the resources they get are segregated, and the resources they get are distributed unequally. For all these reasons, please vote negative.
All right. 30 seconds. All right. The order will be case, the affirmative case, the counterplan, and the DA. All right. Time starts. Now, so first on my affirmative case, we are going to go for my second contention about the natives contention, which is that current federal policies are bad for native education and enforces bad linguistic education for natives. Only natives teaching natives is good in in the specific context of children in pre-K facilities and things like that. And we are saying that the affirmative universal childcare is key and science is blank check to for natives so that they can implement a self-determined childcare policy that allows them to a self-determined childcare policy that allows the natives to teach natives about native cultures and native languages, which definitely solves back for our impact. Solves back for our impact. I'll answer their specific arguments first. They say that their evidence doesn't talk about UCC doing this, but our evidence they say that we don't talk about UCC doing this, but our evidence specifically talks about how in the context of pre-K education we are targeting these Native Americans, allow natives to teach natives. You should read our evidence that specifically says that USFG kind of sucks and the USFG should just fund this and appropriate this, but that the USFG should just fund this, but natives should run this in the first place, which takes out this argument. You say that USFG implements it, but again, it's not USFG implementation, it's USFG funding, but it's still native governed and tribal funded and tribally implemented, which takes out this argument. Next, they say self-determination doesn't matter, but no, self-determination is specifically what solves by for all of our impact. Yes, federal government will not address all native tribal governments, but tribal governments could allow other governments that the federal government has not recognized to gain access to the universal childcare. This is what self-determination is, and it solves back for our impacts. Even if they don't do this, it's still sufficient to solve our impacts since we solve a majority of colonialism. Since we just still solve a majority of colonialism, their own evidence is that 2/3 of tribes are still federally recognized, which proves that we still have it in turning to colonialism by resolving more colonialism than the history of the United States has done. Next, on the racism contention, we will concede to his argument. This is only defense on our argument because it only provides a reason as to why racism will be bad. Because racism will only just be bad as the status quo, but not be worse than the status quo, which means that this is just defense and the office meaning that we're not going for the racism contention on the counterplan. We're going to go hard for the solvency deficit in this round. They do an absolutely bad job of answering it. They don't solve the natives contention. They concede that you should hold them to not the text of the current plan, but the evidence of the current plan. It's just the professional advocating for the current plan that decides those specific implementation procedures. Their current plan, their own solvency advocate literally says that U.S. policymakers and intervening is good. U.S. policymakers intervention is good, and that USFG implementation is good. It literally says that USFG will that US their own evidence literally says that policymakers and from the USFG should concentrate and things like that, which percent it won't be natives teaching natives, and it definitely doesn't solve the affirmative. Any risk of a solvency deficit outweighs, which is the work I'll do on the second on the DA. Any risk of a solvency deficit outweighs because you have conceded frame, which is that social justice is the biggest impact in this round. Native American genocide actually sucks under social justice. You say if a war breaks out, it sucks, but you have conceded root cause claims, and you say crime will lead to Black people being blamed. But again, like they have no evidence for this, and we're not claiming for racism in this round.